This week on Inside the Issues, Thomas Weiss on the responsibility to protect. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CG online podcast. I'm your host, David Welch, the CG Chair of Global Security at the Balsley School of International Affairs and Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. Every week we talk to a noted expert on some aspect of global governance, and this week I'm very happy to welcome to the studios here at the Center for International Governance Innovation Professor Thomas Weiss, who is the Presidential Professor of Political Science at the City University of New York Graduate Center, as well as Director of the Ralph Bunche Institute for International Studies, and until recently, the co-director of the United Nations Intellectual History Project. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you, David.
So, Tom, you have a lot of experience as a practitioner and a student of the United Nations, in particular its humanitarian activities or lack thereof in certain cases. And you have an insider's knowledge of the responsibility to protect doctrine. So we're very grateful for you to be here today.
Good to be here.
Maybe you could fill us in a little bit on the background of the doctrine of the responsibility to protect and your own particular role in shaping it and nudging it.
Well, my own particular role reflected my graduate student exposure to Lloyd Axworthy when we were both at Princeton together, and when he was putting together this notion of a commission, he needed a research director, and he thought of me. And I said yes, and that was a wild ride because the commission itself, unlike other commissions that functioned for 3 or 4 years, this was a forced pace march of not much over a year. The first meeting took place in November of 2000, and the report itself was published in December of 2001. And so through thick and thin with our fearless co-chairs, Gareth Evans and Mohammed Sinoon, and lots of other folks, including the leading opposition member, Michael Ignatieff, looked at the issue of what was called humanitarian intervention. What do you do in the eye of a genocidal storm? Is it possible to react? The background to this really was the crisis in Rwanda, where clearly nothing was done, or too little, too late. And people like Romeo Dallaire have in fact documented all of that. And then the Kosovo reaction, 5 years later in 1999, in which some people, not I, thought that too much too soon occurred with humanitarian bombing and regime change in Kosovo. So those were the bookends, and the commission was put together to see if there was a way to dig ourselves out of the trench in which we were, in which sovereignty was sacrosanct, and oh, by the way, we're not supposed to permit genocide.
Now, the UN, of course, as a system was built around the principle of state sovereignty. The members are all sovereign states. Along with that go certain prerogatives and privileges and immunities, and one of the sacred principles is non-interference. So the responsibility to protect fundamentally changes, doesn't it? That notion of sovereignty. How does it do that?
Well, it changes the notion of sovereignty because instead of the characteristics that you point to in your introductory course and lawyers point to in a course in public international law, namely the Montevideo Convention, and you've got people, and you've got authority, and you've got a territory. R2P suggests that there's an additional characteristic, namely a modicum of respect for human rights. Not the garden variety violation of human rights that we see in lots of places, but at least conscience-shocking mass atrocities no longer are part of the job description of a sovereign. And so the responsibility to protect tries to say that sovereignty entails responsibilities as well as rights, and among those responsibilities are taking care of your own population. And if you do not take care of your own population, to use the terms, are unwilling or unable, or yourself are the perpetrator, as the case may be, of mass atrocities, then you lose your sovereignty, and that responsibility to protect people devolves toward the international community of states.
So in a sense, sovereignty becomes something that governments have to earn. It's not
That's
something
right.
they're
It's
entitled
contingent
to.
rather than absolute. And in particular, it doesn't include no longer the license to engage in mass murder.
Right. Although it never really did. I mean, it was simply unspoken. That wasn't a topic people
That's right.
talked
That's the way it
about.
was interpreted. Yeah.
But Rwanda, some people characterize it as a failure of a collective action failure, right? Nobody really wanted to spend the resources to try to deal with an emerging problem in an area of no perceived strategic interest. Is that the whole story, or is part of the story also that there was no ideational rubric, there was no doctrine or explicit provision in the UN Charter or in international law that actually would have justified a massive intervention of that kind?
Well, I think that Rwanda is the one case in which there was a genocide. The only legal piece of paper that supposedly entails any obligations happens to be the Genocide Convention, which was the reason why, as a recent report from a commission that looked into the Canadian and American reactions in 1994 clearly pointed out, was that using the R word seemed to say to bureaucrats that they were supposed to do something. Therefore, a great amount of attention was paid, particularly in Washington by Clinton, not to say genocide in Rwanda, and because that would have entailed the responsibility or the obligation actually to do something. So we didn't call it a genocide, we simply said it was a crisis, and nothing happened. But it seems to me that whether it's Rwanda or years earlier, Somalia or Bosnia or wherever, where there is a will, and there happens to be a military capacity, that intervention will take place. When we'll fast forward later in the show to a contemporary situation, it does seem to me that having a good hook, having the responsibility to protect hook, facilitates a conversation, and it facilitates action in a way that obviously was not possible in 1994.
Well, let's continue with that in a moment when we come back. You are watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. Tom, you said that in some people's view, Kosovo was an overreaction. Now, we know, of course, that there were some countries that were very unhappy about the Kosovo situation in 1998, and in fact, the UN didn't authorize aggressive action to protect Kosovar Albanians. A couple of questions follow from that. One is, were there ever any real enthusiasts at the United Nations for R2P? We know that there were opponents, people who didn't like this concept, China in particular, for example. Were there real enthusiasts, countries who were true believers and were willing to backstop a forward doctrine such as the responsibility to protect?
At what period, for example?
Anytime between Rwanda and Kosovo.
Oh, between Rwanda and Kosovo. Well, it seems to me, as to go back to the origins of this commission, that actually the government of Canada and the foreign minister of Canada, who happened to be interested in such issues at the time, they no longer are, were trying to be in the forefront. And in fact, I did some interviews that suggested, because the Security Council was definitely paralyzed, that clearly the Chinese and the Russians were going to use their veto. There was some thought given at the time to taking the case of Kosovo to the General Assembly to use the old provision of uniting for peace. When the heads were counted, or the noses, or whatever was being counted, it seemed unlikely that there would have been the 129 two-thirds majority that would be necessary to give a resolution that doesn't have any binding authority, but that would have had perhaps a little moral authority. So there clearly were a lot of people on the fence. There were clearly a lot of countries that were hostile, but there clearly were a large number of countries that would have supported such a robust action when the Security Council refused to act.
And other than Canada, who was notable in terms of supporting?
Well, I think actually virtually all of the Western world was on board. And a lot of the global South, but in a sort of more or less visible and less enthusiastic way. I mean, it's clear that the remnants of colonialism are there. And anyone with a modest knowledge of history knows that a lot of sins were justified by using humanitarian to cover what were anything except humanitarian motives. So there was, shall I say, mixed support or mixed enthusiasm throughout the global South. That's, if we were to fast forward, that's actually changed substantially now. There are many more friends of the notion, not only in the North, but also across the South.
Mm-hmm. Although only recently have we had, I suppose, the next major step in the development of the doctrine. So there's quite a long period of time after. So why was that? Was it just generally agreed that this was too much, too fast?
Well, you as well as I study politics, it rarely moves in a nice linear fashion. So as I look back at my own analytical career on this issue, in early 1990s, after the first Gulf War and the sort of use of force in northern Iraq, there was kind of nothing that we couldn't do. And then in 1994, there was nothing we could do. And then in 1999,
nothing we did do anyway.
Yes, in 1999, once again, the sky was the limit with Kosovo and East Timor. The responsibility to protect, the commission met during 2000, published a report in 2001. The publication of the report was very poorly timed if you're into marketing. This was only a few months after September 11th. So the report met with a certain amount of success in the office of the Secretary General, Kofi Annan, who had been pushing this concept and pushing human rights from his own bully pulpit at the time. But the new preoccupation became immediately terrorism, security. If we move ahead then to the year 2005, the 60th anniversary of the United Nations, a conversation occurred about a new compact. It was not exactly a San Francisco moment, which is what the Secretary General was hoping for, but it was an anniversary to take stock. And actually, virtually nothing came out of that meeting in my mind, except for, well, actually three things. The Human Rights Council, which either was a step forward or sideways, maybe ahead in some people's mind. The Peace Building Commission, which I think was a new step to try to recognize the acute needs of countries coming out of conflict, and the responsibility to protect. When the princes and presidents and prime ministers who gathered in New York in September 2005 agreed to 3 paragraphs about the responsibility to protect. That consensus was part of this larger package, and I think was very wide and not very deep. And so shortly thereafter, the countries that had always been much more keen about sacrosanct state sovereignty, the Cubas, the Nicaraguas, the Venezuelas, the Malaysias, the Indias, the Sudans, the Zimbabwe's of this world, immediately began a kind of rearguard action, if that's the right term, to try to say, well, there was this agreement among heads of state and government, but it wasn't quite an agreement. So then there was a period of backsliding, backstabbing, trying to pull back from what had been the agreement in the year 2005. So it was within that context that the original commissioners, in particular the 2 co-chairs, contacted me once again, since I had the research directorate, and said, would it be worthwhile establishing a research and advocacy center to try to at least strengthen the hands of the friends, or at least get in the way occasionally of the spoilers. And the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect was established in 2007, gets going in 2008, which was exactly the same moment that the new Secretary General made R2P part of, we're not going to call it a legacy quite, but anyway, as an emphasis. And he named a special advisor on the prevention of genocide, and also a special advisor with a writ for R2P. So all of that came together just a few years ago. And then the General Assembly discussions in the last 2 years have become distinctly more positive, which gets us to 2011 and recent adventures.
Okay, well, we'll talk about those in just a minute. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. Do want to talk about Libya, which of course is the recent development that's given some new life to the doctrine of the responsibility to protect. But in between Kosovo and Libya, there were various opportunities, I suppose, when we might have pushed the doctrine forward. Now, you referred to sort of backsliding. I take it nobody, at least not many people, were backsliding in the sense of changing their minds about the desirability of having such a doctrine or the moral point behind R2P.
Absolutely not. It was
But there was an attempt to reinterpret it as less sort of a license for military action from outside and more
that's right.
an effort to persuade.
That's right. Well, the responsibility to protect, the focus of the Commission's work was actually reacting. What do you do when a genocidal storm strikes? But the conception, and I think this was actually fairly original, was a three-pronged responsibility. A responsibility to try to prevent all hell from breaking out, a responsibility to react if there was a conscious shocking event, and then also the responsibility to pick up the pieces afterwards. So there was a three-pronged event. What happened as a result of what I described earlier as at least a significant amount of dissent was that the Secretary General and a certain number of member states emphasized the first part of the responsibility to prevent, which in its worst interpretations became an excuse to do anything the UN has ever done, development, and et cetera, et cetera. The Secretary General, in fact, formulated a new version of R2P, which he had three pillars. The first pillar was the prevention pillar that included the responsibility of states to their own citizens. That's where we started, so that's fine. The second was the second pillar was that these states, however weak or feeble, needed to have their capacities built to take care of their own citizens or protect them when they could. And then the third pillar, which was actually an excuse not to talk about military intervention, included military intervention. And then his conception actually left aside post-conflict peace building. But we never got around to discussing the third pillar, which was always the most controversial. The other two almost anyone could agree to. And so the emphasis was placed there for a couple of years. And so it was the politics of trying to navigate the spoilers, as I would say, in the global south. And rather than confronting them and saying, we got to do something in Darfur, we got to do something in the DRC. We can't allow Comrade Bob Mugabe to run amok in Zimbabwe. The idea was, well, let's emphasize the others and not push the robust, the hard end of the stick, shall we say, of R2P.
Which is ironic in part because the new African Union Charter actually, in a sense, included R2P. It gave the members the right to intervene in each other's internal affairs for exactly
That's right.
that purpose.
Well, African politics is oftentimes hard to generalize about, and what is said in New York or Addis Ababa oftentimes varies. But you're absolutely correct. The Article 4H of the Constitution, it's called the Constitutive Act of the African Union, in fact, has the most bullish language that exists on other states coming to the rescue of strangers in the face of grave mass atrocities. However, that African Union rhetoric has never been used in a specific action. And so meanwhile, we had the UN's steady rhetoric, but sliding toward prevention, the African Union's bullish rhetoric with no action, and the outcome was ongoing crises here, there, and elsewhere with absolutely or very little outside intervention.
So fast forward to February 26th, 2011.
Here we are.
Resolution 1970, yes. And then less than a month later, Resolution 1973. What explains this sudden jump forward?
Well, I actually think the existence of what we called earlier the hook, the ready-made framework of the responsibility to protect made the conversation about acting in Libya easier. Now, it's also clear that there are few heads of state who have fewer friends than the good Colonel Gaddafi. So it was probably politically fairly attractive for everyone to react. But the conversation about R2P was very different because it was the responsibility to protect. And the first resolution, which agreed to a host of measures unanimously in the Security Council after only a couple of days debate, was really quite striking for the UN, at least, to move this quickly and come up with a whole set of actions, agreed actions, including an arms embargo, including asset freeze, including travel bans and other measures, and a reference to the International Criminal Court to investigate crimes against humanity and war crimes. So that was one day. And very quickly thereafter also, the Human Rights Council, it actually was the day before, the Human Rights Council used the responsibility to protect language to not only criticize Libya, which is a member of the Human Rights Council, but to request that the General Assembly consider the matter. And the General Assembly, as a result of the R2P language, took the decision to suspend Libya's membership in the Human Rights Council. It's the only time, or the first time in UN history, when an elected member state was thrown off of an existing body. So the political consensus actually was fairly uniform, and the idea that something had to be done soon was front and center. I think then the politics on the ground in Libya and the actions by President Gaddafi to say that anyone who got in his way, including the cockroaches who were members of the opposition, exactly the same language used by the Hutu regime in Rwanda before the genocide, he used to describe what he was going to do to any opponents who got in his way in Libya. So this quickly became a situation in which an unpopular, globally and an unpopular local leader was promising to take actions against his own population. And then when he opened gunfire with helicopters and bombers, it became clear that he was serious and that something had to be done.
Unusually nimble action on the part of the UN.
Absolutely.
We'll be back in a moment with Tom Weiss. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us on cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So Resolution 1970, which you described as that package of measures passed very quickly by a unanimous vote in the Security Council, passed quickly in your view because it wasn't military action.
That's right.
So people leapt to it as an alternative to military action.
In fact, I believe that the reason it was passed so quickly was that already a no-fly zone and the protection of civilians was being bandied about in New York. And I was told, although I haven't verified this, that an early draft of the resolution, which was being pushed by the United Kingdom and France, actually had that language in it. It was eliminated. So it seemed that the kinds of measures that are usually arrived at by the UN after protracted negotiations that might last years were agreed in a matter of hours, actually, and certainly in days without the no-fly zone. So that after the ground was sort of laid for reconsideration of the issue, particularly when the regime got involved in what was clearly, according to anyone's definition, a rather horrendous measures against your own population, opening fire with machine guns from helicopters and bombing. And it was at that point that a resolution moved through very quickly. Once again, although this time there were 5 abstentions, but according to the Security Council rules, as we all know, as long as there are no vetoes with more than 9 votes, it passes. It seems to me that the actual agreement to military force with 5 abstentions is actually a step in the right direction. There were countries, including Germany, that were not very enthusiastic. There were countries which were even less enthusiastic, namely China and Russia, which went along, as well as Brazil and India. And it seems to me that the difference here was the support locally. I mean, there was, France had already agreed to recognize the opposition, whatever that was, somewhat prematurely in many people's views, but they had done that. So there was an expressed will to help locally that it was expressed. And in addition, there was also a regional support. The Arab League, as well as the African Union, supported the imposition of a no-fly zone to protect civilians. So at that point, the UN imprimatur actually was very useful in terms of the Western countries involved. And it was also eventually useful, I think, in terms of Qatar's and the United Arab Emirates at least participating in the enforcement of the no-fly zone after air defenses were knocked out and most of the planes destroyed.
Mm-hmm. And yet, as far as I know, nobody's actually used the word genocide with reference to Libya.
No, but the resolution from 2005 that we spoke about earlier included 4 triggers, if you will. Genocide is obviously one of them, but it's also included war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. So undoubtedly, if this is a war, there are war crimes in attacking civilians, or if it's not a war, there are war crimes in play. So those two, or one of the two, or two of the two, are in fact justifications for the responsibility to protect as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, the rebels in Libya have actually been critical that NATO has not been energetic enough in its exercise of this authority.
Yes.
And of course, the Russians and Chinese think it's been too energetic. Is it possible that NATO, using this resolution as a justification, is in fact contributing to a stalemate that at the end of the day may wind up resulting in more deaths, more harm, more damage?
Anything is possible, but it seems to me that enforcing the principle that there's not a carte blanche that sovereignty provides to do anything you wish to your own population is an important principle to underline. Obviously, the dust is anything except settled. If the intervention goes reasonably well, it seems to me that the doctrine of R2P will have real teeth. If the intervention goes sour, poorly, we have a kind of Somalia-like situation in Libya, then in fact it will be easier to mobilize what I've earlier called the spoilers the next time to make an argument against ever getting involved in such an adventure in the future. I think there's serious debate as to whether or not NATO has overstepped the mandate. The mandate was the enforcement of a no-fly zone or the use of all necessary measures to have a no-fly zone and to protect civilians. So clearly the no-fly zone is in place. It seems to me that the protection of civilians would certainly also involve attacks on military vehicles and columns of soldiers, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think NATO has overstepped its bounds, but those who thought it was only a no-fly zone clearly think that NATO has gone too far.
Is it consistent with the moral principles behind R2P to do things like building golden bridges for your enemy, arranging for graceful exits or murderous dictators such as Colonel Gaddafi? Or if you're going to go down the R2P route, are you committed to the whole basket of International Criminal Court proceedings and all the rest of it?
It's actually not specified either in the paragraphs of 138, 39, and 40 of the World Summit document, and it's actually also not even in the original Commission document from 2001. I'd say that most people who support the norm, it's not quite a doctrine, but the norm of the responsibility to protect also would be quite enthusiastic about a consistent application of human rights standards and a consistent use of the International Criminal Court.
Mm-hmm. And do you think the United Nations is always going to be willing to delegate this kind of action to regional players such as NATO, or
I
Or is
think
this
it's
something
the only choice. The United Nations has no independent military capacity of serious war fighting.
I'm thinking in terms of the decision-making about what
the
kinds of
decision-making.
missions to fly or how.
It seems to me that the devolution of authority toward regional organizations is what we've been doing ever since the United Nations got out of the enforcement business shortly after the Somalia debacle and later, so that if anything involving enforcement is involved, it's handed over to ECOWAS in West Africa or to NATO in North Africa or the Balkans or other regional organizations, perhaps the African Union one day.
Are there any other places in the world today where you could imagine a good case for energetic international action on the basis of R2P?
Well, I think one of the things that we always have to keep in mind is what's possible. Libya resulted because it was possible. It seems to me that a country like the Sudan with extraordinarily long lines of supply, huge area, sparsely populated, is not an ideal candidate, nor is the Democratic Republic of Congo, because the same questions, even though they're, I'd say, ideal candidates for the operationalization of R2P.
So much hinges on how well Libya turns out for the doctrine.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much, Tom, for spending the time with us today. Appreciate your insights. You're watching CG's Inside the Issues video podcast series. Please join us again next week and look for us on cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube, where you can find our complete collection of episodes today.